Welcome to IO in Action, where we dive into the science of work and the people who make it happen. Join us as we explore the latest research, real-world applications, and expert insights in the world of industrial organizational psychology. Today on IO in Action, we are excited to welcome Dr. Gary Burns, a practitioner and researcher whose work focuses on measuring and predicting individual differences and how they relate to organizational behavior and decision-making. He has lots of applied experience that we will be diving into today. Welcome, Gary.
Well, thank you.
Also joining us today, we are excited to welcome Dr. Cody Harrell, a recent graduate of the IO PhD program here at Florida Tech. He has been a pillar in the IO program and brings experience in consulting and involvement in a variety of impactful projects. Welcome, Cody.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we will be discussing practical experiences, lessons learned, and insights for anyone curious about applied IO work. So kicking us off, Gary, you have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got into this field? What sparked your interest?
Yeah, and I'd say there's probably two different things there that influenced me early on. I knew I wanted to teach. A group of friends and I had actually developed this plans that we were going to move out west and teach on a reservation, but that did not happen. In community college, the part that pulled me towards IO psychology was I got involved with a clinical psychology professor, Phil McClung, who was doing organizational training, and he needed people to help with logistics side. And it really highlighted to me that, you can apply psychology to these organizational problems, and it was a financially stable area in which to work, and that had a lot of attraction to me.
Thank you, Gary. So Cody, is your story similar to Gary? What drew you to the exciting world of IO psychology?
I don't know if I would say similar in the sense that I never had any plans to move out west, but that would be very, very exciting just from a teaching perspective. My story on how I got into IO, probably pretty similar to a lot of folks in our field. I initially wanted to be a clinical psychologist and focus on different personality disorders, the more extreme cases that are out there. And I kind of went back and forth between clinical, IO. I also considered social psychology. And eventually I landed on IO because I think to some extent we have a better chance of having an impact on a larger number of people, and specifically in the workforce, which I think is a pretty big part of anybody's life. So, I ultimately made the decision because I wanted to have the most reaching of a positive impact, I would say.
Thank you for sharing. So you both have some impressive applied projects under your belt. When did you know that you were interested in doing applied work? Was there some kind of moment that really made you think, I really enjoy helping this larger group of people?
Yeah, I can take that. So outside of my undergraduate and graduate school, I'd say my first real applied experience. So I was in a graduate practicum class, and I was getting to work with a Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. It was a performance appraisal project, and they were using the same performance appraisal form for every single job across the entire reservation. So from casino floor worker to sanitation staff. So that project really opened up my eyes to kind of thinking about some of the different logistics that are involved in managing humans within the workplace and the science behind that. So that for me was really that big moment.
Thank you, Gary. So Cody, how did you get your start in applied work? When did you get that opportunity, and kind of how did it come about?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think, for me, applied work, the thoughts of wanting to apply concepts probably started back in high school, like many of us asking the question of when am I ever going to use this information that I actually have to learn for the test and remember. So I always kind of had this desire to apply the things that I was learning. And I think once I got into graduate school and getting to see some of the different concepts that we were learning and how they essentially directly applied to employees, almost all of the academic journal articles that we're reading in the journals like Journal of Applied Psychology, they are directed at the workforce. And you could tell that the target audience is either practitioners, researchers, or oftentimes both. So I think that, the idea of learning something to one day be able to use it was always very inspiring to me. And so being able to kind of take that forward into my professional career has been something I've been grateful for.
Yeah, so Cody, could you tell us a little bit more about like your most memorable, applied experience? What were kind of those thoughts and feelings when you were asked to work on that project and as it started kicking up?
Yeah, sure. So my first semester of graduate school, actually, I was a member of the Center for Organizational Effectiveness, and Jim Taylor, the director, who I believe has been on this podcast before at one point in time. So he asked me to be a part of a leadership development project for a public transportation company out in California. And essentially, it was a 2-day workshop they were developing. As a first-year graduate student, though, I kind of assumed my responsibilities were going to be more in a support role, in the sense that maybe I'd be taking notes or collecting data, whatever it is, kind of at a lower risk level. It turns out they kind of threw me right into the fire, which I was very appreciative of. I remember, I think the first couple of weeks working on the project, I was already conducting interviews with some of the stakeholders. So getting to obtain that experience right off the bat was super cool. In terms of thoughts, like I said, a lot of gratitude, especially for Jim for having the trust in me to do a good job. Also, the ability to learn under our project lead, Dr. Anthony Belluccia, who was phenomenal mentor of mine. So I think that first project was instrumental to me of learning where are the performance standards for these applied projects and what does it take to actually accomplish a goal like this and deliver to the client.
Yeah, I'm building off that. So Gary, when you started your applied work, what was kind of that most memorable initial experience that you had? How did that opportunity become available to you?
Yeah, so in terms of how the opportunity came available, unlike what we have here, so one of the things that attracted me to Florida Tech was the amount of applied experience and the opportunities that we have for our students. Going through my program, it was very different. We had a practicum class, and that was how you could really get involved, and really the only opportunity unless you were out doing something on your own. And so I came from that a very different way kind of later in my graduate education. One of the things that Cody said that sticks out to me and that I would kind of flag is thinking about that stakeholder buy-in and what's kind of going on. Going back to that Saginaw and Chippewa tribe project, having that same performance appraisal form, it was interesting to see there was a number of people who just kind of wrote the entire process off, that this is just, bureaucratic hoops that we have to jump through. But there were other people who had devised and developed their own system for managing and motivating their employees. So really thinking about that, stakeholder buy-in and getting everyone kind of communicating and talking about things. You can have a perfectly validated tool, but if people don't trust you or use it correctly, it's not going to have the impact that you want to see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gary. So at the end of both of these projects for you all, how did you feel? What did you really learn about yourselves? And what did you take away from that applied setting, beyond the things that we've already discussed, like the importance of the performance appraisal and that stakeholder buy-in? What are the pieces that really stuck with you and you thought, okay, I need to take this to my next applied project so that I can build on it? Cody, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think for me it was learning about the process, and I touched on this a little bit with understanding what it takes in terms of standards, but being able to envision in your mind the full project life cycle is, I think, something that's very hard to do until you've done it. And I came out of the first project with the public transportation company understanding start to finish, how are things going to evolve? How am I going to evolve over that time? And so being able to navigate that for the next project and all the ones that come out of that after that was very important to me. So, just understanding how are things going to look in the beginning, how are things going to look in the middle when maybe changes occur and obstacles get thrown your way? How are you able to adapt and keep your cool the whole time, all the way up until the finish line when you're delivering the project and maybe something goes wrong on the day? how can you adapt there and overcome those challenges to still deliver whatever quality your client's looking for.
It's definitely a very meaningful experience to get that full project life cycle. Oftentimes we touch on pieces of that and we don't really get to see it through. So it's definitely impactful to see that all the way through and understand what it looks like. Gary, would you like to share some of those kinds of thoughts and feelings, takeaways that you had from, your first applied project?
So I think kind of what changed my thinking the most during that process, and as graduate students, you guys get a lot of technical training and technical knowledge, but realizing that the technical solution is rarely the hardest part of the position that really influenced, myself moving forward.
We have the science and we learn the tools, but how do we make this practical and most valuable for the workplace? So now we're going to kind of get into some stories from the field. So I want to know from both of you, we'll start with Gary, what applied experience was the most fun for you to work on? What really made this project something that you enjoyed and you look back on very fondly?
So the projects I enjoy the most are often the ones I have students working with me on. There's something about having that opportunity to engage in that training and development that really reaches me and sparks my interest. I'd say that one of the most fun projects was I just preface this. I do like to work with nonprofit organizations and municipalities. I find that they often need the most help but don't have the resources for that. So we were working with a municipality that had a high turnover kind of component, and they were worried about the supervisor and the morale and kind of what was going on in the city workers. Kind of came in, did a job audit, and did some basic kind of job analysis, including some kind of observations. And one thing that became very clear quickly was that people weren't doing the jobs that was associated with their job descriptions. These jobs had morphed over time. One person was essentially doing 3 different jobs that had kind of fallen onto them. So just really addressing the importance of job analysis and the structural parts of what we do. Once we were able to kind of address that, the people problems started making more sense. And I really love that kind of systems level detective work.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a rewarding experience to dig deep and be able to find what's truly going on. So Cody, what experience was the most fun for you?
The one that was most fun for me, I would say, is an assessment development project that I worked on at the Center for Organizational Effectiveness. And I was lucky enough to be the lead for this project. Spanned roughly 3 years in terms of my tenure. And I think what the most fun part about it is how it evolved over time, not only from our ideation and what we thought the assessment was going to become and where it was going to go, but also the different graduate students and people that touched this project over the course of those 3 years. I counted, last night, I think it's 17 total people, 2 faculty advisors, including Dr. Gary Burns and Jim Taylor, and then 15 graduate students over the course of those 3 years. And it was really interesting to see, one, how the team evolved and learning how does succession planning look in a project team like that when graduate school, as everyone here knows, turnover is huge. I mean, you're going to have the next cohort of students come in and try to figure out how to work with that project with different people. I think it was a really cool experience. Maybe not as accurate of a reflection of what it's going to look like, in a bigger organization. So it was cool to see how that kind of played out.
What applied experience do you both feel was the most formative for you? Maybe it changed the way you think about applied work, or maybe it opened your eyes to something else. Maybe it was just the people that you were working with. So we'll start with Cody.
Yeah, I think the last point you made there about the people is really, really important. The most formative applied experience that I've had, also a project with the center, And it was a combination between the Center and Institute for Cultural Collaboration and Management at Florida Tech. It was a project for Johnson & Johnson. And having such a large client like that is really what made it so formative for me. Because as I mentioned earlier, we've had projects with public transportation companies, we've developed assessments, but to get to this stage where you've got a Fortune 500 client on the other side expecting some sort of deliverable, it's a type of pressure that you can't get anywhere else. So, it taught me how to behave under pressure, not only as someone working on the project, but as a leader for the team, and being able to make decisions about those team members was huge. So, if somebody needed to take time off, how are we going to fill that gap? If someone got sick, how are we going to fill that gap in terms of the work output? How are you communicating with your stakeholder consistently? We had certain times we had emails going out to the client to make sure we're still on the same page. Sometimes it was touch point meetings, whatever it is. That type of pressure was huge for me, especially early on in my career. I mentioned performance standards earlier, and I think that this applies here too, where the bar just got raised, and it was, you need to be able to produce this and learn how to navigate those challenges that are inevitably going to come.
Yeah, thank you, Cody, for sharing that. Gary, what applied experience did you find most formative?
So working with students, and this, we emphasize this a lot, but when you're actually in the field and dealing with it, you can't overstate it, but just the importance of communication and having those clear roles and communicating those assumptions to your different team members in terms of what's going through. And that came from one of my early projects working with students where we were working with a nonprofit retirement community, and I did not have the best communication practices in place for the team because I was making a lot of assumptions that we all were communicating and had a good plan. So that really emphasized to me the importance of moving forward on that. Kind of on a personal level, I love designing systems and I love analyzing data, but one of the more formative parts came when I realized that I do not really enjoy actually client-facing activities. I'm a very introverted individual, and I prefer not to have that focus on myself. Plus, I don't have a lot of those skill sets as well, so kind of realizing what I needed to work on and focus was great.
Well, thank you, Gary, for coming on this podcast today and, really trying to exercise that extrovert in you. We really appreciate that. And we definitely see how you and Cody are a great team. Cody seems to really enjoy this client-facing work. And then we have Gary, like the brains of the operation here.
Yeah, I'll put Cody up front where they can't see my faces that I'm making.
So thank you for sharing those stories from the field. Just wanted to really touch in. We've heard a lot of different IO concepts here, but how do you feel that your background in IO psychology helps you navigate these implied experiences? Is there one piece that sticks out the most to you? We'll start with Cody.
I'm going to take the easy one because I have a feeling Gary has a much more nuanced answer than I'm going to have. But I think the easy answer and probably the foundation of our field, scientist practitioner mindset, I think is really, really important, especially when working with clients. And something that I learned early on in graduate school, this is actually a lesson from Dr. Rich Griffith, who I also believe was on this podcast at one point, so shout out. He told us that to be a good applied practitioner, you almost have to learn the science even better than someone who's only focusing in academia. And part of the point to that, not a knock by any means to academics, but just to emphasize the role that fully understanding the science in a way that you can see it from different perspectives is something that's incredibly important when working with clients, because you realistically don't know where they're coming from or where they're starting at. So being able to meet them where they're at, either intellectually, conceptually, jargon-wise, culturally, whatever it is, that can make that relationship so much stronger. So I think the scientist practitioner mindset's important, but then also understanding how to translate that science into actionable insights. not just at face value of I can translate a correlation into what it means in layman's terms, but I can translate a correlation into the terms that you understand. So getting to understand your client, knowing them more, I think is really important and something that I want to continue to take with me.
I would actually just emphasize and repeat some of those aspects that Cody has. So, I mean, while communication is key and you need to, practice and continue working on that communication because it really does multiply your impact, you need to get technically strong fast. You need to, develop that solid foundation of knowledge and skills and having that technical expertise so that you can pivot and adjust depending upon what's happening.
Thank you both for sharing that. So we want to give our listeners some lessons learned in this applied work. We want them to be able to listen to this and take some tools away. So we'll start with what surprised you most about applied work? What was something that you really did not expect to discover? And then were there any other times where maybe your suspicions were confirmed? You thought applied work would be like this, and then it kind of turned out to be exactly like that. So we'll start with Gary.
Okay. Well, I already mentioned the not loving client-facing work, and I think I had I'm coming from a very low economic background. I'm like a hill person, and I thought a lot of the information about kind of bias and prejudice was just largely stories, but professionalism plays such a critical role in what we do and how people view you and whether or not they take you seriously. And early on I had kind of discounted that to my detriment. I remember it was with a police department in Wisconsin, and I'm sitting there chatting with the director, and they keep kind of checking their watch, and I'm trying to move past the small talk and into the business while we're there, specifically with the assessment system and the reports that they were using for their hiring sergeants. And they just seemed to be getting annoyed with me, and they finally were like, well, when's Professor Burns going to get here? So, taking that professionalism seriously, how you present yourself, the image that you're conveying. So it's super important.
Knowing you are an introvert, Gary, what was your immediate reaction to that? Did you have anything to say, or?
I am not going to get this job. That was my immediate response in my mind to that. Yes.
So knowing that thought in your brain, kind of how did you proceed and get through the rest of this meeting? Or did you just get up and leave and say, thank you for your time?
No, I continued with the meeting and laid out some of the issues and concerns with what they were doing. They had a incredibly redundant system, and they were spending a lot of money that they did not need to be spending. And I had some solutions that would have saved them a lot of money, but it was evident for the rest of that meeting that they were discounting what they were saying, that I was just this, kid, for a lack of better word, who was not wearing a suit and, didn't know what they were talking about.
So is it safe to say this group was not a client you worked with?
Not until 4 years later. Yeah.
All right. So there is a redemption story here. What did you do differently the second time?
The second time I did wear a suit, but they had reached out to me because they had they were coming to the understanding that their systems were redundant and they were spending too much money on what they were getting. And so, for that second one, I did wear a suit to that meeting.
All right. So Dr. Burns was right. He predicted the future about their system, and then they did come back to you. So there is a win in there. Thank you for sharing that lesson learned on, or that professionalism component. And Cody?
I think the story I want to tell is along the same lines of being able to convince clients and what that actually takes. What really surprised me most, and this probably came because of how much I loved graduate school at the time, and I absolutely still loved graduate school, but how much I loved graduate school and the field of IO psychology and all of the value that I saw in the things that we were studying and the projects that we were a part of. And so it came to a surprise to me when sometimes clients might be hesitant to believe everything that you're saying or believe that there is any value in it. Because for me at the time, I was very young in my career. I think I was a second year at the time when I was speaking to this client. And I won't name any names for this story, but when I was discussing the project with the client, I could tell that there was some pushback, and I just couldn't understand why. Because this tool that we were trying to deliver to them, in my head, was going to change their system, was going to unlock secrets to their organization that maybe they weren't paying attention to. But the client I was speaking to was really pressing me hard of, what is the value of this? The first meeting, we kind of walked away with more questions than answers, which is okay in some cases. So when we revisited the client and met again, I was able to take a little bit of a softer approach. Instead of coming on and saying, hey, this tool is going to do this, 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 and this, it's going to be really great for you, I actually tried to take a different approach of information gathering and develop that relationship a little bit better. One thing I want to add, on that first meeting, we had some issues with the scheduling. People were late to the meeting. There was a bunch of different variables going on. So the whole environment was already kind of a catastrophe to begin with. Which might be another lesson learned of, the environment can make a pretty big impact. Like even when, we started today, we had some time to kind of talk amongst ourselves before starting recording. I think something like that's really huge. It's similar to the small talk before meetings. And maybe that's why Gary keeps me around, is so I can handle the small talk for client engagements. And then we can bring him in for the hard hitting stuff. But yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons learned, but being able to convince a client and then also change them from the we've always done it this way culture, if it is a company that's been doing it the exact same way for an extended period of time, coming in and saying, hey, I've got all the answers for you. You kind of look like somewhat like an alien, coming from the outer space and saying that I've got this tool that's going to change the game. So I think having self-awareness and developing the relationship with the client is something to emphasize.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So are there any additional lessons learned, do you think, that our listeners should really be able to take away from this and implement? Maybe there's one other kind of big lesson that really sticks out to you for some reason. Is there any experience that really saliently just left you with, okay, this has to be different. I can't do this? Beyond the professionalism and wearing the suit and scheduling our meetings so everybody comes at the same time.
Yeah, I really like Cody's previous message, and going back to what we've mentioned this previously, that stakeholder management and kind of understanding their different perspectives, where they're kind of coming from, why they're reaching out to you. A lot of times when I've worked with clients, they have solutions ready in mind that may not be looking at, that may be responding to symptoms that they're seeing and not what that true underlying problem is. Or they may have a assessment plan that's already mapped out and how they're going to be using it for development without any of the work of actually building that assessment itself. And so, you're expected now to come in and develop something that fits those pre-existing notions. So that type of relationship building and stakeholder management is huge.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback off that too with the things like assessments or anytime you're building something for a client. One thing that I've been keeping in mind is a good enough model that the client can understand and buy into is far better and more impactful than a model that they can't understand, and one that maybe you thought was perfect, but it gets ignored. That latter model is not going to be used, and you're not going to have impactful change. So I think understanding, tying back again to performance standards of what do you have to meet, and can you meet that in the allotted time that you've got with the stakeholder on the other end, I think is super important. So, it's nice to strive for perfection, but understanding that perfection is literally impossible in most cases. Going for the good enough model that gets used and you see positive change is always the best way to go.
And do either of you have a tip or a piece of advice for students or early career professionals in IO psychology who are looking to get started with these applied experiences? Are there any strategies that can help you get these projects secured?
I'm not 100% sure on the strategies to get these projects secured. I feel like in part I've been lucky for many of my applied experiences, but looking back over 20 years of applied experience, you're not lucky that often. I think a lot of it is you need to get out there and make those connections, look for those opportunities. You find, what is it that you love and where are your strengths at, and looking for opportunities to really apply those in that area, but also making sure that you're not, stagnating, or that you're still taking that chance to kind of grow and develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think development's huge. Luck, I think, oftentimes comes down to when opportunity meets preparedness. So if you can prepare as much as possible so that when the opportunity comes, you're able to capitalize on it. That's, I think, one way to help secure more projects, because sometimes a client's going to come, and if you have nothing ready for them, or if you're not on top of your game and you're not ready to respond, then that client's going to go to the next person, the next IO psychologist that's ready. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Another one, more on the development side of things, is developing that self-awareness. Gary mentioned the part about, maybe he should have worn a suit in that meeting. Maybe that would have made a difference. Maybe it wouldn't have. But either way, he's had that thought that I'm going to wear the suit the next time. Same thing goes for showing up on time to a meeting, or, drafting out a ton of notes before to make sure that you know what you need to say and the points that you need to hit. So I think, developing your skills. Something else that I wish I did more of early on was expose myself more to things like messy data, or even large organizational data sets. The more comfortable you can get with using data, I think that's going to help with your decision making. It's also going to help other leaders make more informed decisions. I think there's a lot of organizations still out there operating on intuition rather than actually looking at the data that they've got in their company and then saying, okay, this is the best approach to take moving forward to try to see, maybe it's an uptick in job satisfaction, employee engagement, or maybe you want to reduce some turnover going on. But a lot of those decisions become hard if you're not using the data. So
jumping on that, I think a lot of early consultants, researchers, people working with organizations don't realize how hard it is to bring that data together. Just combining different data sets, linking components. Again, having that experience with messy data can really, give you some really good insight into that.
Thank you both for sharing these tips. So we just want to take a look into the future. Looking ahead, is there a dream applied experience or project that you all have? What area would this experience be in? What would the clients be like that you're working with? Do you have a dream project? Gary, we'll start with you.
Yeah. And I'm going to circle back a little bit to that last question and tie it into this. So, thinking about kind of my dream project, I would encourage your listeners to keep in mind that, our careers are long, and that, you need to stay, agile and continue that kind of development so that you continue to have these opportunities so that you do continue to grow. And that's, what I look for a lot of times with my applied projects as well, is not only how can I help people out, but what are some of those benefits and those components for me. So really any project that does give me that opportunity to kind of stretch and grow a little bit, excites me, quite a bit. Selfishly, I want to say continuing working with students where they are doing all the client facing kind of aspects. But realistically, it's thinking about how to handle those implementation hurdles that organizations have. Like, for example, I'd love to do something again with 360-degree feedback. A lot of the organizations I've worked with in the past who want to implement that were not ready for 360-degree feedback, either in terms of the acceptance of that upward feedback or even just the technology to facilitate it. I'd like to continue working on or with companies that have that type of technology, to implement some of these solutions. Often implementation is, outweighs the great ideas that you might have. And so I want that great company that has a lot of technology, a lot of spare resources to work with it, and then students to meet with those folks.
Yeah, very similar for me. I think, talking about the client first, someone with a lot of infrastructure like Gary mentioned. And what probably excites me most about that part is it would end up being high stakes, similar to the Johnson & Johnson project. So, any client that I think is a huge operator in the world is somebody that I want to work with because, tying back to the first part of this podcast, that reach that you can have on a lot of people, I think would be really cool to see come to fruition. On the infrastructure side of things, cutting edge technology is always really, really interesting to me. So if we could do something with maybe like an AI augmented assessment, so combining AI and maybe it's 360 as well, and we can build out this tool that companies can use to increase their awareness of people, and then that can cascade into things like coaching or talent development initiatives, even selection in some cases. So something with a lot of innovation and in a high stakes environment, I think is appealing to me.
All right, so now we know if you are a listener or if you know somebody who is interested in 360-degree feedback or AI augmented work, you can contact Dr. Gary Burns and Dr. Cody Harrell. So just one more thing that before we wrap up today, what are you most excited for about the future of applied IO psychology? I see we're touching on this AI perhaps and some of those innovations, but is there something that really makes you look forward to doing applied work in the future?
I'll start us out on that. That last question was really about kind of that dream project and what I'd like to do. And I'll stand behind what I said, but one of the things that keeps me going is thinking about these smaller organizations that are dealing with so many problems and how can we really help them? That's the science we practice really does have a direct impact on people's lives. We spend so much of our time in work, and that's really what kind of keeps me going. So while I want that AI assessment and to play with that really big data, the idea of being able to help someone who might not have those resources to implement those larger systems. And we can do that. There's so many small, simple things that we learn as IO psychologists that we can help organizations with. That really motivates me.
Yeah, along similar lines, I have appreciated the wave that has come with so many companies learning about IO psychology and some of the things that we can do, and seeing more and more companies take on a lot of our processes, I think is something I'm looking forward to. I see we see this even with AI, that there's going to be some obstacles or challenges or pushback in many different ways when trying to implement these big things within organizations. But if we can figure out a way to do it a little bit more seamlessly, I think to Gary's point, even at the smaller level, we can still have a really positive impact on those people.
Is there anything that we did not touch on today that you all would like to share, something you feel is a really meaningful takeaway, or just an important, qualifier for our listeners to know?
I'll emphasize again those kind of technical skills and that ground knowledge. So, being familiar with those basic organizational theories that are out there, having a firm foundation of job analysis. Just that the more technically sound you are, I think the more flexible that you can be moving forward.
I've got a somewhat of a, wishy-washy or less technical lesson that I started taking on probably second or third year of graduate school that I was really grateful to come across. And it was actually a video little clip that I saw, and the speaker was Dr. Ellen Langer, professor at Harvard. And she pretty much explained that rather than wasting time trying to make the decision perfect, spend more time, rather than wasting time trying to make the right decision, spend more time trying to make the decision right. And really what she meant by that is instead of stressing yourself out and wondering whether or not you made the right decision, after you've made that decision, focus all of your energy on trying to do whatever it takes to make sure it's a positive outcome. The example that she gives is to her Harvard students, you probably had the decision between Harvard or Yale. Well, you're at Harvard now. There's no way to tell whether or not Yale was going to be a better experience or not. So all of your time and energy should be on making your time at Harvard the best it possibly can be. So I would say that for any graduate student or any early career professionals, you're going to make mistakes along the way. Make the best decision that you can, and then make that decision as good as possible after it's made.
Yeah, I circle back. Keep in mind equifinality, that there's multiple destinations to that same goal and the same position, and again, whichever path you're traveling, focus on making that the best possible path you can.
Thank you both. Well, today we discussed practical experiences, lessons learned, and some insights for anyone curious about applied IO work. Thank you, Dr. Gary Burns and Dr. Cody Harrell, for coming on the podcast. Thanks for tuning in to IO in Action. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe to our podcast. Also, get connected with us on LinkedIn at the Center for Organizational Effectiveness and Instagram at Center for Org Effectiveness for more information on the application of science at work. Until next time, keep putting IO into action.